Welcome to a tutorial on the Battle of the Atlantic. I'm going to pause in between each slide so that if you want to pause the video to take notes, you can do that. I'm also going to post the video, I'm also going to post the PowerPoint on SlideShare so that you can have access to the slides in that form as well. So here are the contents. We're going to look at what was the role of the Navy at the beginning of the war and how did that change as the Germans tried to attack the Allied convoys in the North Atlantic. Before we start, I want to give you an idea of how does the Battle of the Atlantic fit into the rest of the Second World War as far as Canada is concerned. So I've created this timeline. At the top is the Royal Navy. Down here are the activities of the Canadian Army. You can see that the Army had infantry soldiers, infantry divisions, as well as armored divisions. And then at the bottom we have the Royal Canadian Air Force. So when we're looking at the Battle of the Atlantic, it really is the major role of the Canadian Navy for the whole war. Now there were Canadian naval operations in other theaters. However, the Battle of the Atlantic is the big one. And you can see here that I've tried to emphasize that for the first 2/3 of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic was a battle or a campaign that was being lost by the Allies. And it wasn't until the middle of 1943 that the tide starts to change, pardon the pun. Okay, so as we begin, it's important for you to understand that the Allies entered the war way behind the Germans. In 1933, Hitler came to power, and almost from the start, he began building the German military machine, both in terms of men and equipment. While this was going on, the Allies, especially the British, were proposing a policy of disarmament and appeasement. What that meant is that when the Allies entered the war, they were way behind the Germans in terms of number of airplanes and quality of equipment, because of course the Germans had been building new equipment, and much of the Allied equipment was old, leftovers from the First World War and poorly produced items in the 1920s. The Germans also, if you look here, is a picture of the Graf Spee, a German pocket battleship. Now the Versailles Treaty limited the number of tons that the German Navy could have, and so what they did was they built these small battleships, but ships with huge guns. They also built a lot of smaller ships like fast torpedo boats that didn't fall under the Versailles restrictions. Now, what was going on in Canada? Well, after the First World War, you'll remember that Canada had quite a large army, 500,000 men in uniform, and all of that just was disbanded after the First World War. Of course, in the 1930s, the Depression was going on, and Canada didn't have money to be spending on a military. In May of 1940, France fell to German occupation, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, realized that Britain was going to have to rely on Canada. We really were her only major ally at the beginning of the war. Okay, as the war starts, the British are left with the impression that they have a great navy. This picture shows HMS Hood. This ship was designed in the First World War. It was built or launched in the early 1920s. Unfortunately, I think that the British were fooling themselves in terms of just how powerful their navy was. Now, when Canada entered the war, we had a very small navy, and I think only 13 ships. And the British also had a small navy in terms of being able to fight a world war. One of the things that the British did right away was negotiate with the Americans in a program called Lend-Lease. And basically what this meant is that the Americans, who politically were isolationists, they did not want to be involved in war. However, the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, knew that America would eventually have to come into the war, so they wanted to make sure that the Allies had the best hope for a strong beginning. And so basically the Americans would do things like fly airplanes to the Canadian-American border, and then Canadian aircrew would bring the planes across. One of the more famous Lend-Lease programs is called Destroyers for Bases, and basically the Americans give the British 50 old First World War destroyers, and in return the British promised to let the Americans occupy British territory for naval bases. One of the famous ones is in Newfoundland. So Britain realizes that they need to keep a supply line to North America. Europe is being overrun by the Nazis, and so the only hope for Britain to get enough food, oil, and other material is to be able to take it from North America. Now, in the 1930s, the Germans had been building their navy. The most powerful battleship, or the reputed most powerful battleship in the world at the time, is Bismarck, and she is launched in 1939. This is a good example of how Hitler had basically ignored the Versailles Treaty after the mid-1930s. In 1936, his soldiers reoccupied the Rhineland, and he started aircraft production, even though Germany was banned from having an air force, and started to rebuild his navy. So this is another shot of Bismarck. She had a sister ship, the Tirpitz. Hitler didn't have time to build more. Now, this is interesting because this shows that at the beginning of the war, both the British and the Germans are interested in building battleships. By the end of the war, especially the Americans showed that the battleship really was obsolete and it had been replaced by the aircraft carrier. Okay, so this picture is good because it illustrates the armor plate that Bismarck had on her hull. This is something that HMS Hood did not have. Of course, the British were interested in what was Bismarck doing. She made a run from Norway into the Atlantic Ocean with another battleship, Prince Eugen, and then the two battleships split up. You can see here the importance of aircraft in naval warfare. Airplanes can fly much faster than ships can travel, and so when it comes to knowing where the enemy ships are, you need planes. Unfortunately for the British, in the Straits of Denmark, HMS Hood was sunk. The Bismarck got a direct hit above Hood's magazine, and all of the munitions on the battleship exploded. The ship sank very quickly. Only 2 sailors survived. Churchill's response to this is quite simply, sink the Bismarck. This was a propaganda coup for the Germans, and it was a disaster for the British. If the British Navy was unable to defend Great Britain, the war would most certainly be lost. Okay, this is another example of the importance of aircraft in naval warfare. The British launched these 1920s era biplanes. It's called the Swordfish. They're loaded with torpedoes, and one of the pilots and aircrew from this plane managed to have a hit with their torpedo onto the rudder of Bismarck. It, in essence, destroyed the Bismarck's ability to maneuver. And then HMS Prince of Wales and HMS George V, 2 British battleships, were able to engage Bismarck and sink her. Okay, next I'd like to talk about the real threat in the Battle of the Atlantic, and that is the U-boat, German undersea Booten. Okay, there were a number of different types of U-boats that were built. This photograph shows a Type 7. By far the largest number of U-boats were Type 7 U-boats. In terms of its armament, you can see that up here in the tower are 2 anti-aircraft guns. So the Germans are anticipating attack by aircraft. On the bow was normally located a deck gun. So U-boats weren't always underwater. In fact, they needed to spend a lot of time above the water in order to run their diesel engines. The diesel engines were used to generate electricity for the batteries. When the ship was underwater, it would run on battery power. Of course, it also has torpedoes, And something that I learned this year that I didn't know before is that the U-boats could launch undersea mines. These mines, 2 mines per torpedo tube, could be launched as well. This photograph is actually from the U-boat, one of the U-boat memorials in Germany. In terms of the scale, you can see the people here on the stairs at the front, and so it gives you an idea of the scope of size for these ships. This is a rare color photograph of a U-boat surfaced. This is a picture of a captain of a U-boat. The pennants that are flying from the periscope mast are recording the number of tons of shipping that this particular U-boat has sunk. Now, what is the effect of torpedoes? Well, obviously, they're able to sink ships. Now, the sailors that they were sinking were members of what was called the Merchant Marine. These are civilian sailors. If you ask me, a much tougher job than the Royal Canadian Navy sailors. Of course, they're fighting on ships that are, for the most part, unarmed. Now, later in the war, they did start to put guns on some of the merchant ships. However, in terms of being able to defend against the U-boats, they didn't have a very good chance. Unfortunately for these sailors, if their ship was sunk, they often ended up in the water. The North Atlantic is freezing cold, even in the summer. The other thing is that when a ship sinks, this happens to be an oil tanker, obviously all of the oil that was in the ship or the fuel that is used to power the ship is going to go in the water as well. And that means that the sailors are going to be swimming in water that is often on fire. And at the very least, the sailors will be covered in oil, often ingesting the oil. And so the survivability rate of sailors going into the North Atlantic was actually quite low. The quotation at the bottom with Hitler says, "Starve Britain," and that was basically the plan. He figured that he would need to starve Britain into submission. Now, the Germans have 2 periods during the U-boat war, which they call the happy time. The first one is when the U-boats were operating off the French and British coast. This happens at the beginning of the war. However, the second happy time, where the U-boats were forced by aircraft to leave the French-British coast and sail across the Atlantic Ocean to the North American coast, is where they sunk many more ships. You can see from the slide that a quarter of all U-boat sinkings occurred in 1942 off the American coast. Now, what was the role of the Royal Canadian Navy? Remember that the Canadian Navy had only 13 ships at the beginning of the war, and those were all old ships. One of the primary roles of the Royal Canadian Navy is to escort the convoys of supplies across the North Atlantic. Of course, they're also involved in the defense of both the east and west coast of Canada. There was an example on the west coast where a Japanese submarine fired a couple of shots at one of the Vancouver Island lighthouses, not a real threat. However, the threat on the east coast was real. Remember that in the second happy time, the Germans were sinking a great number of ships off the coast of America and Canada. The U-boats were actually going right up the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River, and they were sinking Canadian ships very close to Montreal. Of course, the third role of the Royal Canadian Navy would be in other naval operations, both in the air and on the water, doing things like hunting battleships. In terms of the area where the Royal Canadian Navy is operating, the North Atlantic, of course, is freezing cold in the wintertime. The picture on the top shows the buildup of ice on the deck of a ship, and the picture on the bottom shows the ferocity of the storms that these ships would have to sail through. Next, I want to talk about countermeasures, but I'm going to leave that to part 2.